Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Flying and Eating. Today, let's go somewhere and do something, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
Hey everyone, it's Adam here, and welcome to my American Presidential Library series. I am currently in my hometown of Chicago, Illinois, and behind me is the future site of President Barack Obama's Presidential Library. This site, which at the time I'm recording this, is set to open sometime later next year in 2025, so obviously that could kind of change. But I thought, in anticipation of this happening, it would be fun to go to all the previously existing presidential libraries, of which there are 13. This will be the 14th. We will do them in continuity order by seniority of president, and we'll just talk all about them. They are kind of a rare thing, kind of spaced throughout the country, and as this series goes, you'll learn more and more about each one of these presidents. Our Presidential Library Series tour continues in Abilene, Kansas, at the 4th Presidential Library, that of the 34th President of the United States, Dwight D Eisenhower. Nate, are you excited to learn all about President Eisenhower?
Yes, I am, and I can't believe we're here.
Yeah, that was kind of a drive, but we really appreciate you doing that.
Yeah.
Kind of an interesting fact about this one. This is the last presidential library that was kind of built in a small town. After this, they started building them in cities. Funny though, we went to the Harry Truman one, which was in Independence. At the time, that would have been considered a small town, but now it's basically Kansas City. So that one's not hard to get to. This one, little bit of a trek. It is time to get our presidential passport updated. We are getting a stamp right there.
So yeah, you're gonna wanna go to the visitor center first and get your admission here. There's a movie, which I think we're skipping in proud tradition of us. And then we found out so you get a discount if you have a AAA membership. If you're active military, it's free. If you're a child, it's free. I have AAA, so we got a discount. That's kind of cool. We have a little golf club shot glass. Not that I drink, but I actually think that's pretty neat because he was our golfer in president, or golfer in chief.
There it is. I got my stamp because I like Ike. That's where we are now. The chapel is where he's buried. His childhood home is right there. There's a guided tour you have to pay extra for, so we're not going to do that, but we'll film footage around the side for you. There's the museum, which is what we just bought tickets to. The library is just presidential like history, like his actual documents and stuff. That's free and open, to the public. This requires tickets. This is the only thing that stays open beyond 4:30. So heads up when you're coming out here, plan accordingly. This one closes earlier than most of the libraries do. Now keep in mind, he wasn't born here. A lot of the presidents that, where their boyhood home is still part of their library, that was like where they were actually born. That is not the case here. Dwight Eisenhower was actually born down in Texas, but he left there as a toddler. His parents moved him around a lot, along with their whole family. I think he was like 3 of 7 children. I don't remember the exact number, but yeah, he was just one of the family. He was a number in his family. But this is where he would spend most of his life growing up. His parents were super religious, which I'm sure the history of him will all talk about. And yeah, he at one point, he goes into the military prior to World War I. He gets to West Point Academy successfully. His parents, especially his mother, were pacifists, and they were really not happy with him doing this. But in his view, it was the only way for him to get out and see the world.
We're in Kansas, and Kansas, this is notorious for having tornadoes. And here we are with the storm cellar. So if there ever was a storm, you'd go into this cellar.
Yeah.
And they'd lock it.
Like if you've seen Wizard of Oz, this is what Dorothy is trying to do, right? And then she gets into the house, and then the house flies away. Fortunately, Dwight Eisenhower's house never flew away. It did apparently have a giant air conditioner, though, so that's good. Even though he obviously was president of the United States, he always seemed to view himself more as a general. I think he is the last general who was ever president of the United States, at least at the time of this video. So we're coming up on what looks like a little memorial here. Odd location, though, because like right next to it looks like a plant that's just depressing. But then over here is a presidential library. Yeah, this area basically just is a more or less a plaque telling you about all the history of the Eisenhower family and that they came from here. So when you first enter the museum component, you're greeted by some great murals, friendly staff, and a lot more. Yeah, you're welcome. And then you said we should go in through that side?
Yes.
All right, so we're inside here. And like most presidential libraries, they start you off with just kind of where the president came from. Obviously, he came from Abilene, which is obviously where we are. I'm assuming where we're standing right now was all like his family's farm at one point, because that's the childhood home. But I'm imagining they sold a lot of the land over time, which makes sense. Yeah, like I said, he came from a large family. I think he was like the third one in there. They were not particularly successful. He was born down in Texas, as I mentioned before, but he did not stay there very long. His family was very, very poor, and they made their way back up here. They ended up moving around a lot, but this is where he spent most of the time. So here's some surviving documentation and little bits of when he was in what I guess we would now call grammar school, grade school, etc. Things like his diploma and all that sort of stuff. But here's where he starts to become the Dwight Eisenhower we know. So he became utterly fascinated with the military as a young child, and he also eventually kind of saw it as his quote-unquote way out of Abilene just to see the rest of the world. And he ends up applying to West Point, which is obviously a very prestigious military academy in New York that is still obviously around today. His application was accepted. He ends up going out there. He becomes kind of a very average student, but it was still ultimately a success. World War I breaks out in 1917, and he thought, okay, this is my chance. He ends up not actually going out into service. He was ended up being stationed, I think, back down in Texas somewhere, even though he had wanted the Philippines. But he never actually saw combat. Harry Truman is the only American president who actually saw combat operations in World War I. Basically, the war ended before Eisenhower could really participate. Eisenhower was a big football player. There's a good photo of him as Cadet Eisenhower. Interesting guy, because in a lot of ways, nobody ever saw this dude as a potential president. He is similar to Truman in a lot of ways in that he just kind of fell into the presidency. They also talk here in this section about the beginning of a partnership. This is where he meets Mamie Geneva Dowd, who would eventually be, of course, Mamie Eisenhower, future First Lady. And this looks like some of their stuff. So that's, Eisenhower's blue uniform. Dress blues, sorry. Yeah, you know more about that subject than I do. A piece of wedding cake. All right, that's got to be fake. Oh, it actually is really part of it. Actually is. Okay, that's real. So here they talk about the post-World War I stuff and training for modern warfare. Eisenhower was a big proponent of the idea that the U.S. needed to rearm. And now that he never got to serve directly, at least not yet, they established Camp Meade, and it actually talks about a little wargaming that was done between Patton and Eisenhower. We're using like World War I era tanks, but the whole idea was just to try and get everybody to learn more about warfare. Because even though the U.S. won the war, it didn't win it single-handedly, and it only fought for a few months. He also spends a lot of time in Gettysburg, which is eventually where he will retire to. So here they have some of the training materials and things from his time in that era. This flag is actually a 48-star flag that actually has a direct connection. It flew over one of the camps. What was the camp?
Gettysburg.
Gettysburg. Camp Meade. So this actually flew over there and threw over. Camp Colt. And it actually was there while he was in training. It was eventually donated to the museum years later. 48 stars, because of course there were only 48 states at the time. Little spoilers, the last two, Alaska and Hawaii, at least for now, were both added by Dwight Eisenhower when he was president. So this is a very infamous incident. 1919, crossing America. So as part of his time in the service, at some point there was a convoy established that had to basically get all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast, specifically out to San Francisco. So the convoy starts in Washington, D.C., and moves out to San Francisco. Starts on July 7th of 1919. It apparently took them like 2.5 months, and it became a national spectacle because it was just awful. And Eisenhower, let's just say he never forgot that happened. Here they talk about who I was mentioning before. This is Dwight's son, Icky, as they called him. And he would pass away on January 2nd, 1921. And Eisenhower always said this was the greatest disappointment and disaster of his life. They would have other kids, though. John Eisenhower. I don't know if he's the only other one they had, but I'm guessing he was. And he was born in 1922, so a year after Icky had passed away. I don't know if this wheel is like originally part of that convoy. I guess it could be, but the fact that it's like so accessible, I'm not going to touch it. Yeah, so over the next 5 years, from 22 to 27, he's just doing a lot more to study logistics of war and strategies of war. And I know this guy, General Fox Connor, actually played a big role in basically training Eisenhower for the future. So yeah, Connor was one of John J. Pershing's guys. John J. Pershing is the greatest American of all time, by the way, but I've talked about that in the past. The guy, you know, he basically just won World War I and planned out everything you need for World War II. Not a big deal, just the greatest guy ever. This dude, Fox Connor, knew him, and he was introduced to Eisenhower by Patton. And Connor was so impressed by him that he requested to have him transferred to the Panama Canal Zone. At the time, the United States still controlled the Panama Canal, which was something that I believe Teddy Roosevelt had created, or his administration did, where they more or less cut through a canal within Panama. And the advantage of doing that is that rather than ships having to go all the way around South America, they could just cut through Central America and literally shave months off of a journey. And so the United States wanted to keep control of that. And until 1999, they did. It was originally the Jimmy Carter administration that promised to return it, and ultimately Bill Clinton's administration did. But at the time, it was U.S. soil, and Eisenhower would spend a lot of time down there with additional logistics operations and military training and so on and so forth. So that book back there was actually written by Eisenhower in 1928, A Guide to American Battlefields in Europe. Kind of very much foreshadowing. Eisenhower was a big proponent of the simple reality that he believed at the end of the First World War, we would be back to war with, in Europe within 20 years. Much like his, John J. Pershing, not the guy in the photo, but John J. Pershing, who I was talking about before, was very much a proponent of. He was like, that is going to happen. Eisenhower clearly was also preparing for that, which no doubt made him a very effective general when he got the job. At one point, he had a choice: Washington, D.C., or Paris. And he asked Mamie what she would like, and she was kind of like, well, it's not really my place, I just go where you want me to go. But ultimately he's like, make a call, and she said, Paris. So they went to France, and that actually allowed him the ability to kind of study what it was like to be abroad, to study more of French geography, which of course would play a huge role eventually, because he is the guy who orchestrated D-Day. Again, no big deal. Oh, they showed John J. Pershing here. Again, John J. Pershing. I cannot stress this enough. The entire world owes this guy a permanent debt of gratitude. So as Eisenhower's career advances, he's very well liked by Connor and Pershing. He's given several recommendations and really advances the ranks per se. This is where it starts getting weird for him though. So in 1935, he ends up in the Philippines, and he's there till 1939. You have to remember the Philippines used to be a U.S. territory. It was at the time, and he was stationed there. And he was under the command basically of General Douglas MacArthur, famously General Douglas MacArthur, who held the Philippines, lost it, had to reclaim it, largely won the war in the Pacific. So the two of them are there working together. Now, he was his boss, and he did not really like MacArthur, but he was very good at just kind of tolerating him. But the joke was that Dwight lost what was left of his hair pulling it out, trying to police or corral MacArthur in some sense to get him to be a little bit more rational. And of course it happens. December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor, as well as the simultaneous attacks on U.S. territories in the Philippines, as mentioned over there. Things like Guam, Wake Island, all that stuff were hit, and the United States was officially at war with the Axis powers. Of course, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and the Empire of Japan. So Dwight Eisenhower is obviously directly involved, and he has to plan out the wars, or at least plan out the European theater, which largely defines a massive aspect of what we remember Dwight Eisenhower for. As weird as it is to think about this when you look at it on a map today, back then, pretty much everything in red down here was controlled by some European country, or in the case of the Philippines, the United States, and the Empire of Japan just felt that was supposed to all be theirs, and Asia should be for Asians type of logic. From that perspective, it almost made sense, because all that stuff was European colonies, and they were all at war, so they were like, this is our chance. But to go through the Americans, not a great idea. But June of 1942 is when the Japanese lose the Battle of Midway, and they're on defense all the way to the end of the war. But of course, Dwight is more known for the European campaigns, North Africa campaigns, Yeah, that's obviously what they're going to focus more on. But it is interesting. They also, of course, have Abilene marked, which is about as far away from any battle zone as you could possibly get. But as far as the museum goes, it just kind of, this whole section really just is all World War II history, like the political strategy of everything, the geopolitics of it. Giant, really cool section on various armaments that the Allied forces used.
So like these knives the designs are still, some of them are still used today. For knives, and especially the K-bar on the bottom there. It's the Marine.
This bottom one or F?
F.
F, okay.
F, the K-bar. And you can still find these at flea markets and estate sales, etc., etc. And if you can get them at a good price, they're very, very, very collectible.
I could see why. They were also mass produced like crazy. Like, I'm just going to be honest, the gamer in me only recognizes some of these weapons, like the Thompson, because I played Call of Duty 2 so much.
Right.
But yeah, some of these.
There's number 5, I think, is the M4.
Yeah, some of these I only know because of Call of Duty, but like.
Or M1 carbine.
Yeah, M1 carbine. That I remember that one from one of the Call of Duty 2, I think.
Grant is 4, so that one's next to it. It's a higher caliber.
Various outfits that different people would wear depending on, their station or what their purpose was as far as the force goes. I say labor force like that. A lot of the, shall we say, the rah, I'm going to almost say propaganda, but positively type of artwork and things that depict that. Okay, that's just cool. Buy war bonds. That was a big thing. War bonds, because back then the United States didn't really have the funding for this kind of thing. So you had to buy war bonds so that you were helping Uncle Sam have the money to continue to fight the war. But really, this whole section is just about World War II. They have this cool digital calendar of all the major events as they're going on. Very neat. And then over here, 1942, when Eisenhower heads over to London to become basically eventually supreme Allied commander of Europe, because the simple reality for the other European forces is they had either all surrendered or they, unlike the British, they had no choice but to basically do what we said, because without us you're going to lose, and with us you need us, So Dwight Eisenhower ultimately ends up being essentially in control of the campaigns. So he's responsible for the North Africa campaign. When they show up in some of these former French colonies that had been controlled by France that the Germans had taken, they expected to be welcomed as liberators, but there was a lot of resistance to them because a lot of the people who were there didn't like the French either, so they didn't know why they would be helping them. So that was a complicated one, but ultimately it wins out. At least they get the Germans out of there. Let's put it that way. That continues onward into 1943, which eventually leads to the invasion of Sicily and Italy, the liberation, and ultimately they surrender. Mussolini is basically killed by his own people, and effectively Italy is out of the war, which was a huge, huge victory. You can effectively credit both of those, the North Africa campaign and Sicily, specifically the collapse of Italy, to Dwight Eisenhower. You have to remember, I know this sounds insane, the British and the Americans really didn't like each other all that much prior to World War II. Right. You have to keep in mind, one of the things that FDR accomplished in his administration was that ever since the United States was founded, our entire security principle was kick all Europeans out of North America, get all their military assets out. And the last president to finally have anything to do with that was FDR. At the time the World War II breaks out, the British had a whole ton of military bases throughout the Caribbean, like the British Virgin Islands and all that. They had at Canada even. Well, FDR told them, Lend-Lease Act, you want our tanks, you have to get rid of all your military assets. That's how much they still didn't trust each other.
Well, and another thing is, by the time that the United States entered World War II, the British have pretty much almost lost the war. Yeah. And they were almost taken over by the Germans. So they were willing to do anything and everything to get the Americans in the war.
That is 100% correct. And this is also, I just want to point this out because this is really neat. This table is depicted there. That is not a real photo. That's like a painting. And they were never actually, they had all these guys around this table a lot, and they were not allowed to take photos of it for security purposes. Eisenhower sat at this table, and in doing so, he did it when the table was already in of itself 150 years old at that point. From this table, not only did they come up with all this strategy, this is the actual table Eisenhower sat at while he devised the plans for D-Day. The single most significant
strategic victory to liberate Europe and to guarantee the modern day security order. So next to that, they have some of these items. This map is actually France on top and the UK on the bottom. It's like intentionally flipped. And this is something they actually had laying out when they were coming up with plans, because the whole idea was figure out how to get this to there. And yeah, that's why it's intentionally drawn bizarrely. But then they have some other documents and things from like where Eisenhower lived and at the time. It's actually kind of insane, the vibe, especially that table. Like the amount of history and world consequence that came from that table. Here they have a bunch of murals and information about stockpiling and preparation for Normandy. So what they ultimately would do is a bunch of strategic bombing. They did this all over the place, so that it was never obvious to the Germans what they were about to do or where they were about to go. I think he later would tell Richard Nixon something to the effect of like, never tell your enemy what you're going to do, and never tell them what you're going to not do, because either one allows them to plan accordingly. So he basically just said this was his strategy and let them think what they want. In this case, it was just providing a lot of supplies for the future invasion as well as strategic bombing. And then we get, of course, to that point, the actual invasion. This is a very famous audio quote from him. "You are about to embark on the Great Crusade." He writes them this letter basically telling all the D-Day troops like what you're about to do, how hard this is going to be, and he knows the sacrifice you're making. But the truth is, a large part of it actually came down to the weather, and the weather window to actually go in and for the D-Day invasion was very small, to the point where they weren't even sure they're going to be able to pull it off. Eisenhower had to do a lot of his strategy around that. June 6th ended up being like the best looking day for it, and that's when they went ahead. Eisenhower had no idea if this was going to work, so he wrote 3 basic letters. One was the general thing he sent to them, one was the victory speech, and one was the defeat speech. Guess which one he didn't have to use? So here is, of course, props and items from the invasion, successful invasion of defeating the Germans. Of course, we even have German relics. I've seen that in Call of Duty too as well. But I cannot stress this enough. D-Day was the success child of Dwight D Eisenhower. He was the strategist, the logistician behind it, and it would not have happened without him. At least not in the way we saw it. No, it's not the same Pluto, but that would have been cool. So here, of course, they talk more about once he actually got successfully landed on the beach and the plans to basically liberate Paris and everything the United States did to achieve that end. I don't know if this is actually Ike's car during World War II. Yeah, that's a photo of him right there. I think that's really cool. This is his General of the Army uniform. Wow. That's really neat. I did not expect to see that. I think that's the one that's usually in the statues and all that sort of stuff that they mold. That's the actual one. That's really neat. But yeah, so this section is really just about the time as the commander and things that are happening in Europe. No doubt they talk about the Battle of the Bulge, which was probably, I mean, the Germans made a lot of mistakes, to say the least. Battle of the Bulge, probably their worst one. Hitler had this stupid idea that he believed that the Americans didn't have the stomach for the war, etc., etc., and that if he threw what left of his forces at the Americans, he could throw them out of France, and then they would quit, and then that would scare everybody. It was a delusional thought. He spent what he had left, and then once it was broken, which Eisenhower did break it, the Germans just collapsed. History will argue that Hitler shouldn't have done a lot of things, but with those forces he had left, he should have thrown those at the Russians. He would have bought himself a lot more time. But yeah, he did not do that. I don't think there's not too many people that are going to make the case that Hitler was a smart guy. And if they do make that case, they themselves are an idiot. Then they cross the Rhine. This is a big deal because this means once you've crossed the Rhine, you're actually within Germany proper. You're no longer in the territories they conquered. And at that point, it's just a symbolic reality that, yeah, the Germans are going to lose the war, which was known to be very likely well before it, but that felt a lot more official. Of course, you have the Holocaust and the concentration camps. A lot of the photos and imagery we have of this are actually, you can thank Eisenhower for this, because as the Americans were finding these things, they thought it was repulsive, as it was, but most people wanted to just kind of clean it up and move on and not think about it. Eisenhower said, no, history needs to know this happened. He would insist on photographers, filmmakers getting out there and showing this. There were even some towns that were near all in these German towns where this was happening, and he forced his army to get the locals, the German locals, and bring them here and see this, because most of them had no idea that this was happening in their backyard. So most imagery of the Holocaust we have, you can thank Dwight Eisenhower for showing it to us all. FDR dies on April 12th. President Roosevelt is out. Truman becomes president. And only a couple weeks later, Hitler dies. And Truman oversees the end of the war, and Eisenhower did a great job on the campaign. So the war ends on May 7th, 1945. Everybody celebrates on May 8th. Then we get to the Japanese campaign, which here is very truncated because he didn't have much to do with it. He was obviously commander of Europe, but he did go on record as saying he did not think the atomic bombs were a good idea. He first hears about them at the Trinity test in July, and basically says, like, I don't think we should do that, because he thought the Japanese war was going to end anyway. Harry Truman made the decision that he made, and as a result, the 2 atomic bombs went in, and Japan surrendered. So the war ends. And he's celebrated as a hero, as he obviously was. He comes back to Abilene here, and what was expected to be a post-retirement, cozy little life, but he was just too popular, and people kept trying to recruit him to stuff. He was a decorated war hero. I mean, I'm assuming these were like all his medals and everything. I'm not totally sure, but these are basically things he won from different places and for different reasons. And he was just kind of on this like celebrity tour. Once the creation of NATO came about, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was really just, let's be honest, it was because the Americans recognized that the only thing that had stopped the Soviet Union from going any further than they did, because when the war was going on, the Soviet Union fought into Germany, and they were just destroying like every country in their way and then occupying them. The only thing that stopped them where they did was not a piece of paper that said you're not allowed to go any further. It wasn't the Germans that stopped them. It wasn't the British. It wasn't the French. It was the presence of the Americans. And the Americans recognized they needed to stay there because the Russians would continue. If the Russians got to the ocean, to the Atlantic, they could easily run over an already defeated France and mostly defeated UK. And if the Soviets took the ocean, then America's totally accessible to them. Can't allow that. So that's part of the formation of NATO. We had to prop up our allies to act as a wall in between our threat and our security, if you will. So he becomes the first supreme commander of NATO, which was a big deal. He was kind of like, in a sense, he was like George Washington, that he was this former general who was just never allowed to retire because he was too popular and too good at the job, and his country just kept needing him. So here, they're kind of jumping out of World War II and just kind of into other elements, not so much his actual presidency, but here they show his home in Gettysburg. Apparently he wrote a book called The Crusade in Europe, sold very well, and he used the money from that to get them that home in Gettysburg, which I think is pretty neat. And then they have just a few little artifacts from that. So once you leave the I Like Ike area and you turn here, you have the section on Mamie Eisenhower and just a lot of her outfits. Most of the presidential libraries have like at least one little room devoted to the First Lady of the time. Though correct me if I'm wrong, do you remember the Truman one having a room for... Yeah, it didn't have one. This seems to be the entirety of the 1952 election section here. So I guess it's worth talking about it now then. So in 1948, before Truman got his second term, Truman was wildly unpopular and he thought he was going to lose. So actually he had floated to General Eisenhower, hey, do you want to be my running mate? And Eisenhower actually had no interest in politics. He was like, I don't want that job. He had no interest in being president. Fast forward a few years later, Eisenhower is still one of the most popular figures in the country. And at that point, it was pretty well established that Truman had no chance of winning another term. What ends up happening is in 1952, basically both the Democrats and the Republicans went to Eisenhower and they were like, we want you to run. He actually, hilariously, had never voted before, much less had any interest in politics. But he had recognized a couple of things. One, in 1952, he recognized that
He didn't like the idea that the Democrats had been in power for 20 years. Nothing against the Democrats specifically. He just felt it's a democracy. You're supposed to do shifts. It shouldn't be just one party all the time. So that's part of why he chose Republican. The other part, though, is he was very convinced the Republicans would win simply because Truman was so unpopular. So whoever went in would have felt like Truman's third term, which is ironic because Truman ended up being a very popular president much later, but not in his day. And he was concerned that whoever, because basically you got to remember what the climate of the United States was like at the time. Only a few years earlier, the United States was an isolationist country that had no interest in basically dealing with the rest of the world. Meanwhile, Eisenhower himself, as mentioned before, was like the first head of NATO. He absolutely understood the value of the United States' role in the world. And so basically, he felt, because a lot of the current Republican model at the time, felt that we needed to go back to isolationism. We needed to get rid of any sort of base presence or anything and go back to our own thing. And he thought doing that after World War I is exactly why we ended up in World War II. So he felt he had to run for president as a Republican for multiple reasons, but chief among them, just to make sure the United States continued to play babysitter to the rest of the world, which is ironic because he's largely remembered at the very end of his presidency as being the one with the military-industrial complex speech. So here he is once he's in the White House. This is a globe that he had, his cabinet chair, where he gave speeches from, I guess. And then, of course, he walks into the Cold War. Now, the Cold War was established largely by Truman and their relationship with the Soviet Union. The same basic idea was the United States and its allies had to stand up against the Soviet Union and its, let's call them allies, but really it was conquered nations in most cases. And the United States and the Western forces wanted to come up with a strategy of known as containment. Basically, you can't just go in and invade this and shut this down, but you can force it to stop expanding. It's kind of known as the domino theory.
Yep.
Yep, domino. Yep, domino theory. So basically, he's like, if one goes, then another, then another. This was the basic belief that they went with at the time.
Which is not. I mean, who knows if it's even correct or not?
No.
If it wasn't for the reaction to that theory, we probably would. It'd be a different modern world.
Mm-hmm.
But in actuality, we don't think that's entirely true because people don't just turn democratic or turn communist. The wave of democracy isn't the same as the wave of communism.
Correct. Absolutely correct. It's political movements don't happen overnight because your neighbor did it. It's just that, there was a lot to it. But basically, he inherits that type of world, and he also inherits the nuclear atomic reality. Like, they were a nuclear power. Now the Soviet Union was a nuclear power. So a lot goes on in Eisenhower's time where he has to hate nuclear weapons, which he absolutely did, but he also had to recognize they needed to proliferate them and have them, otherwise they would eventually lose. That's what makes him kind of a complicated person. He was effectively a soldier in a sense, but he also didn't want war, but he had to constantly prepare for it. So a lot of things like NORAD, nuclear attack preparedness, reconnaissance flights, test bans, a lot of this stuff came about because of him. Advances in nuclear power, the IAEA, advances in agriculture and nuclear medication, all this sort of medicine, all this stuff comes of his age, partially due to technology, partially due to necessity, partially due to politics. It's a very insane era because we largely look back at the 1950s as this peaceful, amazing time. It actually was a horrific time. It's just that Eisenhower was very good at keeping us away from feeling how bad it actually was to the rest of the world. He used a lot of technology like, I think it was the first presidential campaign ever was his, the 1952 I Like Ike campaign. He also succeeded in this. The Korean War, which had happened under Truman, which is partially why he ended up being so unpopular. Eisenhower had an interesting resolution to this war. So the war actually ends, I believe, in 1953. It sort of technically ends, well, it never really technically ended. As it says here, in fall of 52, it was mostly over, but July 27th, 1953 is when the armistice was signed. So by that point, Eisenhower was president. So there was basically his side was suggesting they should use nuclear weapons in China to kick the Chinese out and win the war. He did not want to do that. He recognized the same guy who basically didn't want Truman to use nukes wasn't going to also be the guy who did them. but the threat was out there. And a lot of people believed incorrectly that that's why the North Koreans kind of ended with an armistice and the Chinese ended with an armistice. They were afraid of nuclear attacks. That actually was only a partial factor. The biggest reason that they backed out was because in 1953, Joseph Stalin died. Joseph Stalin was the biggest proponent of the North Koreans and the Korean War, and they weren't sure the successor was going to continue. So they basically cut their losses where it was, and to this day, the North and South Korea situation has never been resolved. This is a little bit of a side note, but what they called the Formosa Resolution was basically after the Chinese Civil War ended, which had been interrupted by World War II. The former old Republic of China escapes to Taiwan, which had been controlled by the Japanese during and before the war. This is the foundation of today's modern conflict between Taiwan and mainland China. So here's a section on the Suez Crisis, which really should have a much bigger section than it does. But basically what happens here is in 1956, the French and the British, in conjunction with Israel, basically attacked Egypt in the Suez Canal, and they did not inform the United States. The U.S. was very pissed off about this. And the mentality at the time for the French and the British is, even though the British Empire and French empires had collapsed, Israel was a brand new country. These two in particular acted like they were still the dominant world superpowers. Yeah, Eisenhower did not like that. And so basically all I'll say is the United States tried to basically slap the two around and give them a rude awakening and said, you're no longer the world's superpower. We are. This is one of the effects of the Suez Canal incident, is the Eisenhower Doctrine, which basically convinced Congress to give the president authority to act in the Middle East wherever necessary. Yeah, that would that would stick around. Khrushchev eventually showed up to the White House. They had to visit the two men where they were trying to figure out stuff between each other. But yeah, I mean, they got along enough, just well enough not to destroy each other, so you got to give him credit there, I suppose. He also found Joseph McCarthy revolting and basically played a large role in, I'm not going to say ousting McCarthy, but getting rid of McCarthy's influence. Then we had other rising tensions, things like the Warsaw Pact, which mostly was a response to NATO, shall we say, the Soviet version of NATO, which today is now called the CSTO and is completely a joke. Back then, it was basically a bunch of countries forced to work with the Russians against their will. And here, well, I mean, to be fair, that's kind of the CSTO now anyway. But anyway, so the space race begins. On October 4th, 1957, Sputnik is launched into space. Now, fun fact, when the Russians built this, they actually built a second one they never launched. Now, I'd love to show you, but the second one is actually here in Kansas. It's in Hutchinson in a museum, in a space museum. So I don't know how it got here, but that is here as well, if you ever want to kind of sort of see the real Sputnik. So this map, the way it's presented, will actually give you a good idea of what the United States was going for with containment. It formed a bunch of different, we've heard of NATO, but it has these other ones that were going on, at least at the time. So any country that has like a little colored dot had signed up to basically say the Soviet Union is a bad thing and we need to contain it. And so from a simple geographic standpoint, they actually did a pretty good job at that. It obviously worked because eventually the Soviet Union does collapse. This is just about Eisenhower's travels and diplomatic missions. Here are some copies of basically statements he had made before the UN, as well as I'm assuming other like maybe before Congress, I'm not sure. Here, of course, they talk a lot about the space race. We had Sputnik 1 and 2, as we just talked about. The United States, he started putting down a ton of funding for that to get into the space race. So we had the USA's Vanguard gets up there, our Explorer 1. The United States wanted to be second to none in the space race, which, of course, it eventually does. It forms NASA through this. Actually, Eisenhower really contributed to the creation of NASA at all.
Which that should be a bigger thing.
It really should. Like, this is just like a blurb. It's like, dude, the guy kind of created NASA. I know, I agree. And then you have the early satellites, and early astronauts. Oh, check it out. That's not it, obviously, but that's a reproduction of Sputnik, which was obviously very small. This little ball with legs, it almost looked like a crappy spider, scared the crap out of the United States. It's particularly the American people in general were utterly terrified that it meant that, the Soviets had like nuclear weapons in space and they had super alien sophisticated technology. But that fear that drove us is like quintessential to the American experience. The United States is at its absolute best when it overestimates its opponent and really tries to just catch up to an opponent that isn't there. So here they have a whole section on his like domestic accomplishments after we kind of get away from the Cold War vibe. It's worth noting that even though Eisenhower had the Republican moniker, he was at best technically one. He really did not disagree with FDR's New Deal policy or Truman's attempted Fair Deal policy.
And even to the note, he's a Republican
Yeah.
who's in favor of desegregation, and he also, to the point where there is a big special crisis that kind of happens where the Little Rock, Arkansas happens.
Oh, yes.
By basically solidifying his place in history, he sends the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock, Arkansas, which is unheard of.
Yep.
So federal troops in the state has never happened since, or never happened before.
Yep.
It's never happened.
I agree. And it was the right call because it was apparently necessary. If you look at 1954, look at the map in which schools are enforcing segregation, essentially. And he enforced desegregation. So by 1961, it looks like that. By the time he's out of office, there's only 3 states that won't cooperate. This is, in a lot of ways, it's not the exact birth of the civil rights movement that technically sort of happened under Truman, but you can really say this was the first official piece of civil rights legislation was actually signed by Eisenhower. It didn't have a whole lot of teeth to it. It wasn't too enforceable, but he did take those first steps, even though we think of...
Some of the verbiage here.
Yeah.
Race mixing is communism.
Yeah, according to people who don't know what communism is, everything is communism.
Right.
It's just these are just words by idiots to defend their idiocy. Everyone in that photo is a moron. Eisenhower was still actually a proponent of the New Deal. He did make a couple of changes, some of them not in the way that the Republicans expected him to. He actually believed in expansion in certain areas, like Social Security was expanded under Eisenhower. He considered it just part of the American fabric at this point. And it's insane to me that that's still a debate, but it is. But yeah, job growth, education growth, these were things he considered important. Cars were a big deal, and trust me when I say we'll talk about that. But yeah, you have to understand the 1950s, largely because of Eisenhower and the post-war environment. The post-war environment led to massive economic boom because everybody had got to work, industry was completely activated, and American life was looking pretty good compared to the rest of the world. So everybody had the opportunity now for better jobs, better homes, better equipment, better everything. And I guess we'll just talk about it now. While Eisenhower was president, one of the things he initiated, he got funding created for, was the American highway system. Today, the American highway system, as you know it, where you drive crisscross across the country, there's really no other country in the world that has anything like that. Here they talk about the Eisenhower interstate system, and you see that all that stuff. You can thank Eisenhower for that, and it basically stems from a couple of things. One, back in 1919, when he did that journey, which they kind of illustrate there with like that yellow line, he found it almost impossible to do that. So he was like, this is ridiculous. Our country should not be this difficult to navigate and, traverse. But in addition to that, he recognized that if there was ever a nuclear attack, like they were all talking about over there, you would need a road system to be able to escape the cities quickly have any chance of survivors. So if there was a bomb coming to New York, he wanted to make sure there was a good, clean road that would get you out of town. Keep in mind, everybody, if you are an American, your entire country, for the most part, is completely open up to you because of Dwight Eisenhower's experiences as a youth and because he wanted to make sure you had an easier time living your life. I think that's just... this is something that I don't think he gets nearly enough credit for, because you have to think about the psychological ramifications of that. Because in addition to the economic boon that you got from the war, this highway system existing, you created the concept of freedom in a true way that has never existed. Every single person in this photo who has a car has the ability to get anywhere they want to get. Granted, yes, you need gas money or whatever it is. Time is a factor. Real life is a factor. But this random guy could get in his car and drive from New York to Los Angeles. He could do that in a way that was never considered possible before. That's insane. We had entire generations of families who would start on the East Coast, get in a wagon, and by the time they were like 60, they finally made it to LA, or the equivalency of. But yeah, this is a massive accomplishment that I would argue might in some ways be the subtle crown jewel of his entire administration. This is obviously still very in use today. And to my fellow Americans who really don't travel much, other countries are not laid out like this. You can go even to Canada. They have famously that joke in South Park about the one road. There's some truth to that. There's like one highway road across the nation. Look at your options if you are an American. I would say the only other countries that are even kind of like this, maybe Germany, and that's only the western side, and that's only because it was, completely decimated during the war, and they were able to at least partially rebuild it correctly. We are the car country. You can thank Eisenhower for that. So they don't really talk about, a lot of the libraries actually talk about the elections themselves. As you noticed over there, they barely acknowledge it. Future President of the United States, Richard Nixon, was his running mate in 1952 and won. Actually, funny enough, the 1956 election, Eisenhower actually had no interest in running for a second term. He just kind of wanted to be a one-term, one-wonder president, if you will. But he was very aware that Richard Nixon would be the most likely person to run in that election and most likely win. And while he got along with Nixon well enough, he did not, and this is kind of funny, he did not think Nixon would really be the right kind of guy to be president, which of course later would sort of prove to be true depending on how you look at it. But he mostly ran just to keep Nixon away from the presidency, as weird as that sounds. And you got to remember at the time, why would he pick Nixon as his running mate then? It didn't work exactly the same way. The vice presidents were often kind of selected by the convention, not so much the person running. Things have changed a bit over time, but yeah, he just didn't think that Nixon would pan out. In fact, I will be honest, other than a small reference over there, I've not even noticed a reference to Nixon being in this museum, which is a little strange. Now, obviously, Nixon would go run against John Kennedy in 1960 and lose, and I assume Eisenhower actually was somewhat relieved. Famously, while he did endorse Nixon in the 1960 election, he did it somewhat reluctantly. So they also talk here about the power of television and how few people had it in 1950 versus by the time his administration is over. Of course, this is as weird as it sounds to throw us in there, and it's too bad they don't give a shout to it. Part of the reason television got so big wasn't just his administration pushing it and pushing the power of technology. He was the first president to really be able to sit down and regularly talk to the American audience visually. FDR did it through radio. Truman kind of was a mix, but he used the power of TV for not only campaigning, but for points. But the thing they don't really credit here was also, this is going to sound ridiculous, but the success of I Love Lucy really forced everybody to go out and buy TVs. So that was actually huge. But he used the power of TV to give what I would argue is the second most famous farewell to the nation speech in American history. Nixon's resignation being the most famous one. The farewell to the nation speech is a tradition that every American president, when they can, does, where they just give one last speech as president, just to say goodbye, it's been good serving you, et cetera, et cetera. His famously has the statement about the military-industrial complex and how that was new in the American experience. On the one hand, he's warning you about it, but at the same time, he helped to create it.
Right.
And I think but basically the point he was making was, you have to understand the American mentality at the time, like we were talking about over there, is that all the way back when he was elected, is that there was still this mentality in the U.S. that when are we going back to isolationism? Because isolationism is what we did prior to Pearl Harbor. The American military-industrial complex, as we know it, activates on December 7th, 1941, and has not shut down since. Some call that good, some call that bad. Some can also just argue that's the modern-day global security order, NATO, the Bretton Woods Initiative, all these ideas. Bretton Woods Initiative, yes. The idea that the United States has to police the global oceans to basically keep stability so that we don't fall back into the old imperial system that created both world wars in the first place. If I wanted to stand back and take more of an objective historical lens look at the conversation he was trying to have, I think what he was saying is, this is just the world now. We're in charge of it. We're going to have to babysit it. We're going to have to police it. And this is new to us. We've never done this before. And I don't know if it's good or bad, how it'll end, if it will ever end, etc. But he was warning us, essentially, that his time is up, and whoever runs in, which would have been John F. Kennedy, is going to have to deal with it now. He actually had a relatively short post-presidency, but here's some books he wrote in that time. He actually was medically incapacitated for a large part of it. He was at Walter Reed Hospital, but eventually Eisenhower would pass away on March 28th, 1969. He would have a Washington State funeral on March 30th and 31st of 1969. He did not quite live long enough to see the moon landing that he had helped facilitate. He was brought back here to Abilene, and he's buried out there in that chapel, which we will go scope out later. This is the flag that was laid over him. He had opted to be buried here as opposed to anywhere else. He chose to be buried in his hometown of Abilene in the place of meditation constructed to his specifications, as opposed to, like somewhere like Arlington Cemetery or something like that. They don't have a section about it, but Eisenhower here, after Kennedy was assassinated in November 22nd, 1963, they actually rushed Eisenhower, I think actually to Camp David. He was living in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania at the time. And Camp David is like a presidential retreat outside of D.C. And for security reasons, because they had no idea what was going on, there's actually footage of Eisenhower being shuttled out there and just because even the former presidents really didn't have the same kind of, power that they do now, or the same kind of Secret Service, etc. There was still this mentality that he might be necessary or a potential target or something like that, and he might be necessary in that George Washington kind of way, where the country's in chaos and this is the one guy mutually popular enough with everybody to prevail. Eisenhower was one of the few presidents that once he left office at the end of a second term, he was popular. That's actually extremely rare. Most of the time, two-term presidents by the end of the second term are just not particularly well liked. And it wasn't until Ronald Reagan that you would have another two-term Republican president. To be clear, a two-complete-term Ronald Reagan presidency, unlike Nixon, who technically had two terms, but obviously did not complete his second term. So here they talk about the Eisenhower Foundation, which was founded in 1945. The place we're in right now started construction in 1952 before he was even president, though he would win the election that year. And then it kind of, it did groundbreaking apparently in 1959. It was completed in 1962, and it would later be expanded. But yeah, he was once here to give a speech outside of it. So when you leave this whole section, it turns around and they just talk about contributors. And then, like a lot of the libraries, they use some of the extra space they've got to do what look like temporary exhibits. This one seems like they decided to do a temporary exhibit on the Cold War. Check it out. They have a chunk of the Berlin Wall. That is not exactly shocking. I think most presidential libraries have a part of the Berlin Wall. So once you leave there, we're just going to go up and check out the library part. Remember, the library part is free to the public, and they said it focused a lot more on his actual presidency. So I'm guessing if there's any sort of references to Nixon being his VP and what the actual election terms were like, it's probably going to be in there. We'll probably just kind of power through this section though, because
we're wondering where that stuff is, because most that I noticed at Truman was they don't hide the dirty, grimy stuff. Ike is not a very dirty, grimy guy. He's kind of like our, what do you call it?
a good boy.
Yeah, a good Samaritan.
So this is the inside the library section. This is very different from any of the other ones I've ever been to, because this is quasi, there's absolutely nobody here. I think you have to actually check in, because they have a researchers section, and there's a locked room over there. There's a movie theater down at the other end, and then there's an upstairs section with all the documents. Basically, this says the library with proper credentials will kind of let you check out anything, but it's all the original stuff, so nothing's allowed to leave the basic area. We're not really trying to find out what page 48 of some volume doctrine he wrote was, so it's not that big of a deal. But yeah, okay, then I would argue, as I sit down here with you, Nate, as far as presidential libraries go, this is kind of a weird one, because you are right, it has almost nothing on his actual election. I was talking about this before. There's only one reference in there that Nixon was his running mate, and it was just on a bumper sticker.
Well, there was a picture of him with Nixon at a speech.
Oh, I missed that then. But yeah, I think that this place maybe tries to distance itself from Nixon as much as possible.
I would say so.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird.
Eisenhower was actually one of our most prominent golfer presidents, of all time. And he played at this place, the Augusta National Club. And he would very commonly complain that his golf ball would be thrown off by hitting this tree. And And so to the point where he was constantly complaining to the club to remove the tree, which they would not do. But apparently in 2014, there was an ice storm at the club that damaged it to the point where the tree had to go down. So they brought a chunk of it here, and you can see, because tree rings and how they work, what year the tree started versus when it was when they took it down. So Eisenhower was president when it was like this thick. And so in the end, Eisenhower finally defeated that tree. Congratulations. I would say that's the final victory of Dwight D Eisenhower.
Hey everybody, bonus time. This is the Columbine 3, aka the Air Force One used by President Eisenhower during his time in office. This is now available to the public to see in Dayton, Ohio. So yeah, now it's time. We're going to go up to what they call the place of meditation, which is where the final resting place of Dwight D Eisenhower is.
So this one is extremely unique in my experience with presidential graves. It's like inside of a church, as you saw from outside, but it is no joke a church. But here, of course, you have the final resting place of Dwight Eisenhower, which was their first son. Mamie Eisenhower, former First Lady, is there. And of course the man himself, General President David Dwight Eisenhower, or Dwight David Eisenhower, excuse me, right there. Kansas flag, American flag, quotes, and obviously religious imagery, no doubt coming from his background. Yeah, like for real, this is actually a church. Like on this side, they even have pews, and you know, you take your time, you do what you got to do. And then they have obviously the cross up there and all that stuff. But yeah, the president is buried right over there on that side. So now the Sega Pluto has, of course, visited the final resting place of the 34th President of the United States, Dwight D Eisenhower. So it started storming outside, so we're going to tell you our final thoughts on everything here. What do you think of this library? Now that you've got two under your belt.
Two.
And there's the president right below us.
Right below us. He's joining in spirit. Mm-hmm. So I really think there's a reverence to this place. I started out seeing that with the church and seeing it with what was on display. Really, there's an importance of understanding history. I think this is a good place to go to learn more about Dwight Eisenhower and about World War II and about what really shaped modern America. I think this is a very important museum for that.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think this is actually a pretty good library. I think that if it has a fault, it's that it's kind of short for someone who accomplished so much, but maybe that says a lot about him as a personality, that he was not really full of himself, which is always a nice thing. It is very World War II focused before the presidency, which, to be fair, that's what brought him to the presidency at all, was his World War II successes. His actual presidency is not discussed that much. The election is barely discussed at all. They didn't even mention the re-election. I did quite enjoy this museum. It is a bit of a trek to get to it because it is out kind of in the middle of Kansas, not really near anything like major city-wise. Kansas City, I think, is the closest major city, yeah. Although I'm sure there's closer airports. Topeka, yes, closer for sure. But all the same, I think we would both obviously recommend coming here if you want to learn about presidential history, Dwight Eisenhower, and just honestly to see, you know, the memorial, if you will, to one of the most significant human beings in human history. So thank you very much. We're
probably going to get some comments in the video about, you know.
I hope we get comments. Bring on the comments, everybody. All right, I got to put the camera down because it's killing my arm. So thank you guys very much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Check out all social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, etc. I'll put a link in there. You should check out Kansas City Retro, by the way, if you ever get the chance. And Nate, whatever personal stuff you want there, we'll put it there too.
Well, I think just KC Retro, promote that.
For sure. There you go. There's a link in the description. So thank you guys very much for watching. 34th President of the United States thanks you too. We thank him, and we will see you all later.